Thank you. The doors are closed now, so I think that's a sign that we can start with this session. Welcome everybody. This might be the hardest time slot of the day after the lunch. Be aware that the lunch can always appear, but I think we can win and overcome the lunch today because we have a very interesting session ahead. Well, the title of the session, as you can see, is Sports Governance, Roads to Government Action. To me, that already raises a lot of questions, like, should there be a road to government action, for instance? Or are there already roads to government action? What about the autonomy of sport? I think this is one of the major issues that we can see in all debates. What about the autonomy of sport and how can government involvement improve, for instance, the governance in sport? I think these are the main topics of today's afternoon session. Well, as you can see, we don't only have a very interesting topic of the session, but also very interesting presenters. They're sitting all behind the table now, and I will ask them to come forward and do their presentations. We will look at different levels, country level. We have presentations from Flanders, from the UK. We also look at the European level. We have one presentation about the European Union. And we will start off, or kick off with the international level. That will be presented by Stine. What about the procedure of this session? The first, well, all presenters will approximately present for 10 minutes. We are quite comfortable in the time. We have until 4 o'clock. But nevertheless, I will try to keep them to the 10-minute limit. I'd like to ask you to save all your questions up to the end of the session. And then all the presenters will be back behind this table and we can have lively debate with you and maybe also among the members of the jury. I wanted to say that it's not a jury, it's a panel. And the first presenters, they are not sitting behind the table. I don't know why actually, but this is in the papers, and paper is very important if you talk about governance as well, so we keep and stick to the paper. But nevertheless, the first presentation will be done by Mats, and I have to check your last name as Wickstrøm, Stine Alvad from Play the Game. And since they have an exception by not sitting behind the table, we also do it differently according to the questions. So you are the only ones that will have questions right after your presentation. So if you have questions after this presentation, you can just raise your hand and feel free to ask. So we will start off. Stine, Mats, please, the floor is yours. You're going to talk about autonomy in national Olympic committees.
We are Stine and Mats from Play the Game. And we're here to speak a little bit about this autonomy index that we did a while back, looking into the political autonomy of national Olympic committees. When we have these talks about sports governance and about governmental oversights in sports organizations, much like the ones that we're going to have in this session today, the concept of sports autonomy often comes up. But what does it actually mean to be autonomous? And are the national Olympic committees in fact politically autonomous in relation to the national governments? These were some of the questions that we had on our mind when we set out to somehow make a descriptive mapping of the extent of overlaps between the NOC leaderships and around the world and their respective governments. So, the Olympic Charter, what does that say about how do they describe autonomy and what sort of regulations or rules do they have? And it says that the NOCs may cooperate with governmental bodies, and an NOC may decide to elect as members representatives of governments. However, the NOC must preserve their autonomy and resist all pressures of any kind, including political, legal, religious, economic pressures that could prevent them from complying with the charter. So, what we did was to try to gather information about the presidents and the secretary generals of the 205 NOCs. Kuwait is not included in this index because it's currently suspended due to governmental interference. And we decided that if the president or the secretary general was either A, a highly ranked government official or part of the ruling cabinet, or B, a member of the ruling family, we would say that there was a formal relationship between the NOC management and the national government. And we used, as a primary source of data, we used the website of Arnout, the Association of National Olympic Committees, that has a directory of all the NOCs and also includes various amounts of information about the presidents and the secretary generals. Because some of this information was quite scarce, we also in some instances had to look elsewhere to find the information. It's important to notice that having determined on this definition of the NOC leadership and the relatively narrow selection criteria, as well as having a source of information that is also limited. The results of this survey provides a very conservative estimate, and also a snapshot of what the situation looked like in late 2016. So, what we found was that of the 205 surveyed NOCs, 30 of them had a president or secretary general that we determined to be to have a formal overlap with the national government. And Mads is going to go through the numbers.
At first sight, 30 out of 205 NOCs doesn't seem like too high a number. However, when you look at the distribution of the NOCs, it becomes much more interesting. Actually, 16% of the 30 NOCs are hosted by countries located in Asia, and 36% of the countries in Asia host an NOC with leadership who are formally connected to the national government. So what we did was we asked ourselves, why this distribution? How come there are so many countries in Asia hosting these NOCs? And what we thought was that it could have something to do with the characteristics of the political system in which these NOCs operate. And therefore, we included freedom scores from Freedom House. The freedom scores indicates levels of political freedoms in countries worldwide. And as you can see, Africa and Asia as regions, they have score higher, and higher scores, according to Freedom House, means lower level of political freedoms. And you can see on the light blue bar, that indicates the score in countries that hosts these NOCs with leadership connected to national governments. And the evidence is clear. The score is higher in countries hosting the affected NOCs, that is, countries hosting NOCs with leaders who are formally connected to national governments have lower levels of political freedom. And the difference is most pronounced in America and Europe. This graph shows, this table shows the same as the previous graph, but in numbers. And again, you see Asia holds by far the largest number of NOCs, and you also see that the average freedom score in countries hosting these NOCs is much higher. That is, the level of political freedom is lower than the average country in each region. What might we conclude from this index? Well, first of all, it's quite difficult to say whether governments do actually interfere in the political autonomy of NOCs. However, the index does indicate where there are potential risk of conflict of interests. Is this enough cause for example, the IOC to introduce conflict of interest principles, excluding certain individuals, for example, individuals holding a position as a government representative, as becoming executive of a National Olympic Committee? Perhaps not. In any case, we hope that this index will provide a basis for further discussion on the autonomy of national Olympic committees. And if you are more interested, we have a few copies of the Autonomy Index with us, and you can also find the full report on the Games website. Thank you.
Thank you. Hiding a little bit there. Not necessary, I would say. Thanks for this very interesting presentation. And your last remark was, Mats, I hope this will lead to further discussion. So let's start now. Are there any questions? Remarks?
Hi, thanks for the presentation. Certainly a good start on an important issue. And I guess the big question I'm wondering is sort of what next with the autonomy index now? It's all well and good to have an index that we can say who's autonomous, who's not. But where are you going to take it to try to figure out how that, whether what actually predicts that or what actually is predictive of, or is there any sort of plans moving forward?
Well, this index, as I said, it provides a preliminary insight into potential causes. For example, the structure, the characteristics of the political system. But what is needed from here on is further studies and also different types of studies that can be described with a descriptive statistics such as this. So, for example, you could conduct individual case studies of specific cases. In our report, you will also find an appendix that shows each country affected, each country hosting the individual NOCs. And
that question: Do you have a plan for what you're doing?
No,
it's okay.
No,
obviously, this has been a lot of work, so it's just interesting to hear what you might do.
Yeah, sure.
Maybe we should counter this question. Maybe you have suggestions for this.
Yeah. No, we actually don't. To be honest, we don't have it at this moment.
And do you have any suggestions for them?
Well, I certainly think that there would probably be some opportunities, to potentially run with, have to collect some more data of some sort, but to start to look at the different factors related to, you mentioned there kingdom or ruling family. That would be another interesting thing to sort of divvy that out and potentially run some analysis on that. I think it would be fascinating to look at, there was a high amount of political involvement in both Asia and, a low level of freedom in Asia and Africa, but yet there wasn't nearly as much in Africa. So is that because of the African countries maybe being more susceptible to pressure from the IOC versus maybe some of the Asian countries which might have a little bit more money or resources to push back with that? So just like you say, some interesting case studies to potentially look at.
It could also have something to do with the fact that in Asia you have a lot of countries who has ambitions to project their power through sports as compared to Africa. And the fact that they have the financial capabilities to do this might also explain why we see such a high number of nations as compared to Africa, for instance.
Yes, teasing that out.
Yeah.
One question coming from Balkans, I'm a little bit skeptical about this kind of seemingly objective quantitative research that looks like you are doing something with like big data applying on a really small data set, like really, really tiny. That there is a cultural bias that in certain types of democracies or societies, political connections are very explicit. Like people, for example, in Croatia are actually going from the ruling party into Olympic Committee to be president in this kind of situation. In the Western Europe, it's not as blind as that, but that certainly doesn't make them neutral or like more professional. So I'm kind of curious, why did you not use qualitative research? Why didn't you actually look for like media clippings that already ask these questions within nations, that were already looking into political connections in their own countries and kind of potential connections or
Yeah, well, certainly that would have been an interesting idea, and we also thought about that. However, we have seen no studies trying to map exactly how it looks worldwide. So we started to do a fairly conservative study, and this study also will provide, I should say, like an opportunity to pick certain cases and go and look at each country, each region, to see whether there are differences and exactly how these relations between NFC leaders and their attachments to national governments play out. But you also have entirely different political system and structures in each country, so it's quite difficult to make an objective measure encompassing all criteria. So we decided to do it this way, but you're certainly right. You could attempt to look at individual countries and try to understand better of how procedures are connected to governance policy.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for this excellent presentation. My name is Nikolaos Theodorou, public servant of the Greek state. And I would like to talk for 1 minute about the Greek case of the Hellenic Olympic Committee and the International Olympic Academy.
Also a question.
Yes, there is a question behind the autonomy of what makes autonomy in an organization that is entity of the government, entity of the state. For example, in Greece, the National Olympic Committee is fully financed by the Ministry of Sports. It's a business unit of the ministry, meaning that all the regulations and all the laws behind this entity is according to the Greek law and not the law or the code of ethics or the code of conduct of the International Olympic Committee. And in the case of Greece, IOC acted twice as Roman governor Pontius Pilatus. First, it was the case of the Olympic tickets of Sochi, where the president, Mr. Kapralos, accused officially by the IOC Ethics Commission by breaching the code of conduct regarding the bribery of the Olympic tickets of Sochi. When the Greek government tried to investigate this case, IOC stopped them, saying, this is autonomy. You cannot touch Mr. Kapralos, neither nobody in the Olympic Committee. Second case, the elections of the Hellenic Olympic Committee last year. Now the case is at the Greek courts, and the Supreme Court of Greece is investigating the manipulation of the elections inside the Olympic Committee. Again, the IOC and the relevant department who has to do with the relation with the Olympic committees acted as Pontius Pilatus, saying, it's not our business, it's about Greek justice now. IOC and IOC Ethics Committee has nothing to do with this. Do whatever you want, we don't care. This is a comment about how, in governmental level, we have a National Olympic Committee that works under the rules of the government and fully financed by the government. And on the other hand, we have the power from International Olympic Committee that says whatever they like, whenever they like, what they would like to happen in a National Olympic Committee. Any comment? Welcome.
Yeah, your example again illustrates that our results is a conservative estimates of the realities, and in fact might look much worse than what our index indicates. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll check behind the pillar because I can't see everybody. Is there a question on this height as well? No? I saw a finger there.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation. I was wondering, did you have had a look also besides the political system when it comes to the sports system? So what kind of role, actually we heard about the Greek example, whether you had a look into what kind of role does the NOC play in the different countries. So I mean also on the one hand financial wise, who is financing the NOC? But on the other hand, also, is it a merged body? Is it the one having responsibility for all the sports in the country, or whether you included something like that?
The short answer is no, we didn't. But we are happy to hear all these suggestions because we do intend to take this a bit further perhaps in the future, and it's nice to hear this feedback from you because we were highly aware that of course there are many factors at play here, so we'll definitely take note of these suggestions and try to improve them in the future.
Yes, last question.
Okay. You refer at the beginning the political autonomy. So, do you think that you should take into consideration membership of decision makers, as you mentioned, president or general secretary? I think within NOC there are other also very executive positions based on the structure of the NOC. Of course, do you think that you should take into consideration their membership within political parties? Because from those political parties, some of them are consist the government and the ruling party.
Yeah, you're right, you could do that, but it is, again, it's very, very difficult to say exactly how much influence you have as a member of a party. I mean, what are the relations? Because you could also extend it even further and include familiar relations, or you could include friendship or past working relationships and so on.
Let me draw your attention.
Yeah.
Here, on the example of one country that I'm familiar with.
Yeah.
The president of the NOC is the part of executive board of the ruling party. His relatives are member of the government of one country, so I think you should be exploring this because political ties are not always, directly focused within the public administration, but they are sending their political representative within public sector, civil servant, and civil society, and we have transfer of power through the political party, not only within the public administration, but within the civil society, including the sport movement.
Also, maybe it would be interesting to, you were kind of gray-listing people who are actually, or blacklisting. It would be interesting to see if there is a way to whitelist people who didn't have previous political activity at all, who just came as experts into field, into their position. Because then maybe your conservative study would be kind of radically opening some other insights.
Thank you very much, everybody, for your comments and remarks. And I don't know if it's you, but I think in 2 years' time, at the next Play the Game conference, we will see the follow-up of all these suggestions and remarks. So thank you very much. But thank you very much, Stine. So we are skipping to the next presentation. I'll make sure that you get enough attention as well, so sometimes I'll move to this side. Like I said in the beginning, if there are any questions after this presentation, please save them in your mind or on paper, because at the end of the session you will have the opportunity to ask questions to the next presenters. I don't know how long you have been here at the conference, but if you are lucky enough, this could be your third presentation by Arnout. And until now, the first two were very interesting, so we expect the third one also to be the same. Arnout Geeraert, well, for the ones who don't know him, he's a post-doctoral fellow at the University of Leuven. And the driving force, I would say, are behind the National Sports Governance Observer, and he will lead us now into the exciting world of Flanders.
Thanks, Frank, I guess. No, we're going to talk about good governance. I know that good governance is a theme that is hotly debated in all countries now, of course. And I know that several governments are thinking about perhaps maybe we can do something about the governance of our national sport federations. Maybe we can implement a code of good governance. We've seen this example in a few European countries, and some other countries around the world as well. I thought it would be interesting to tell you about what we experienced in Flanders, how we did it in Flanders, because 2 years ago we received a question from the Flemish government, and for those of you who don't know, Flanders is a part of Belgium. Belgium is separated in many different parts because it's such a great and large country. And sport is a regional matter, so sport is a matter of Flanders. The Flemish ministers is one of the Flemish sports federation. There are also Belgian sports federations, but that's another presentation. Maybe a fourth presentation. Yes, sometime. Right, so the Flemish government, all joking aside, they asked me, we have this idea. What we want to do is, we want to have an instrument for measuring good governance. We want to implement that instrument to measure the governance of Flemish sport federations, and sport federations that do not adhere to principles of good governance or do not achieve a certain score of good governance, they should lose funding, part of their funding, about 20% of their funding. That was a very good idea. And they came to me and they asked, can you develop such an instrument? Right? Okay. Let me take you to what we thought when we looked into this issue of achieving compliance with good governance. And we were thinking, well, what does a government ideally have to do to make sure that Flemish or sport federations are compliant with good governance standards? And I've already shown this morning for those of you who attended the morning session. Basically, you have to address two types of federations. And these are ideal types of federations. It's a little bit more complex in reality, but it's just for analytical purposes. You will have federations that are unwilling to do it. Federations that say, term limits, that's not for us, for instance. Yeah. Federations that simply say, we don't want to implement good governance. We don't believe in principles of good governance. What is a good strategy for those federations? Well, first of all, you need to involve them in your policies, and you need to try to explain the importance of good governance. Yeah? That only works to a certain extent. You will always have federations who still do not want to be compliant with good governance principles. Those federations, you need to alter their incentives. How do you do this? Well, by measuring them, by monitoring compliance. Looking into the federations and seeing whether or not they are implementing principles that they are supposed to implement. Then, those federations that do not implement principles of good governance, they need to face repercussion, costs, sanctions. You can have financial sanctions, but another interesting sanction is naming shaming. Just publish the scores that you get. Measure their governance, and those that do poorly, will publish their names and tell the people where they are lacking. We often do not realize that there are also sport federations that are very much willing to comply with good governance standards. But federations that are, in principle, unable to comply. They want to, but they can't. Why? Well, because they don't really know what good governance is, how you implement principles, they don't understand these principles that you devised for them, or they lack the capacity. You have very small federations that need some financial support. Those federations that are unable to comply, you need to explain good governance principles, and you really need to build capacity. You need to offer some form of consulting, some one-on-one advice, and some exchange of best practices. And you also have to give some financial support. So this is ideally what a government or an umbrella federation should do if it wants to achieve compliance with good governance principles. Right. So, the question of the Flemish government was, can you make an instrument so that we can monitor Flemish sports federations and then sanction them if they do not implement good governance? And here already you see that they are only covering two elements, two very important elements, but not all strategies of a good compliance strategy. Keep this in mind. This is how we proceeded. We thought, okay, develop an instrument, we can do that. But first we need to define what good governance is. Good governance is an abstract concept. There are many definitions, many abstract principles, transparency, democracy, accountability, and so on. So we thought we have to have a definition of good governance for Flemish sports federations. What did we do? We started with reviewing codes of good governance in the international sphere, the local sphere, within sports, outside sports, more than 32. We consulted the academic literature on good governance. We received input from the Flemish government, input from the Flemish sports federations. We organized focus group conversations, where 25 federations participated and told us their views. We invited all the Flemish sports federations to the conference so that they can speak their mind and give their opinion on the issue. And then finally, we had an expert group of distinguished international experts, including also Frank, James Seeley from the Australian Sports Commission, and a few other experts. From all that information that we were able to gather, I devised then a code of good governance for Flemish sports federations. That was the ideal, that was like the ideal image of what a Flemish sports federation ideally should be, like a dream image. And from that code of good governance, we then took clear indicators of good governance that are implemented now by the Flemish government, and federations that do not implement all of them, they receive, they lose a bit of their funding. Right, so the code of good governance in Flemish sports federations, this code has been translated in English, it is available. There are, I have to look because I don't know this by heart, 43 principles, 131 criteria, and also 25 guidelines giving tips and hints and tricks to the federations. How can you implement this? From that code, we devised clear indicators of good governance. If your indicators have financial repercussions, you need to make sure that your indicators are very clear, that you set a very clearly defined standard. So the type of indicator that we use are dichotomous indicators, yes or no indicators. The Flemish sports federations either have it or they do not have it. You calculate the scores, and then on the basis of that score, you calculate the percentage of funding that they receive. That's all very good, but that's one standard of good governance, and because it has to be applicable to all federations, it cannot be too ambitious. And we thought, well, we need to encourage Flemish sports federations to go a little bit further. So we also developed these kinds of indicators, like stage indicators. For each of the principles that we devised this for, and there were like 14 principles, I think, we showed the federations, listen, to implement this principle of good governance, ideally you have to go through 4 steps. And once you're in the 4th step, you have implemented the principle completely. So what we ask you to do is to report, just simply report where you are at. Report where you are at, show that to your stakeholders, your internal stakeholders, so that it generates a debate. Your stakeholders know where you are, what you need to do to improve, and perhaps your stakeholders will start to put a little pressure on you to move forward and to score better. So 14 indicators of that type. Yes, it is difficult to implement good governance. You need to explain this. It is also difficult to measure good governance. The Flemish government needs to measure all this. So what we did was we developed meta sheets. Sheets where we explain the importance of each indicator, but also sheets where we explain this is how you implement this. This is what you could do. And this is what you have to do if you are going about to measure these principles of good governance. We devised this for each of our indicators, 29 yes and no indicators and 14 stage indicators. All of this has been published in a report which is written in Dutch, but you can consult it if you're interested in that. And let's get back now to conclude to our little framework here. How can we evaluate now what the Flemish government is doing? I think initially they wanted to monitor and they wanted to sanction. That is what they are doing right now. They are monitoring, they are measuring, and those that will not implement all the principles, they will have financial repercussions. They will lose a little bit of their funding. Involve federations. We really try to involve the federations and convince them of the importance of good governance. Again, we organized focus groups, we organized a conference, we talked with them, and I have the impression that now the Flemish government, or the Flemish government sports agency, is also involving the federations and really explaining what they need to do to be compliant. So I think that's very positive. What about these federations that are unable to comply? Well, we try to explain good governance principles in our meta sheets. We try to explain it when we talk to them, and we really try to tell the Flemish government, you need to explain them how to implement this. And I think this is what they are now doing. From what I hear, they're doing a good job. Flemish Sports Agency is really explaining everything. There's also a Flemish Sports Confederation who has implemented some policies to support the federations. There is consulting, there is one-on-one advice, and the Flemish Sports Confederation is also encouraging the exchange of best practices. Thus far, there has not been any financial support, and I think perhaps this will be a problem for very small federations that will immediately start to lose funding if they are not compliant, and perhaps they should have a little more organizational capacity to implement the principles. But apart from that, I think everything is going rather well. If you want to have more information on that, the Code of Good Governance in Flemish Sports Federations, as told earlier, is published online. Our report with our indicators is published online. And again, for those of you who have not attended the session of yesterday, we have now published the National Sports Governance Observer project, which involves 10 different universities, in which we analyze good governance in national sports federations, and in which we also try to define indicators of good governance. Again, very clearly defined yes or no indicators of good governance. Thank you very much for your
Thank you, Arnout, for your openness about your impressive work, and I'm looking forward to your fourth presentation during the conference. Thanks. And although Belgium might be a great country, as you said, UK is also a great country, and they also have a sport governance observer, not an observer, a sport governance code, I have to say, sorry. And Jane Purdon is here. She's the head of governance and leadership at UK Sport, and she will tell us all about it.
Thank you very much, Frank. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Arnout. I sat there thinking, my goodness, we have walked a very similar walk to yourselves over the past 2 years. So let me tell you more about the Code for Sports Governance introduced into the UK. It is co-authored by UK Sport, who I work for, and our sister organisation, Sport England. And indeed, I am one of the two writers of it, together with a colleague and a dear friend in Sport England. To tell you a little bit about UK Sport, we are the UK's elite sport agency. We're an arm's length body of government, and over each Olympic cycle, we invest somewhere around 420 to 430 million euros into the British Olympic and Paralympic programmes. We do not invest public money into grassroots sport and participation, but our sister organisation, Sport England, and the other home nation, similar bodies in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, do, and indeed Sport England invest a similar amount of money to us, often into the same sports governing bodies. So we're very proud of what we do and the system that we support, and this infographic tells you a little bit about the TGB performance at the Rio Olympics and Paralympics. A lot of facts and stats in there, probably too many to talk you through in 10 minutes. But the headline, the one that personally fires me up on Monday morning when I'm getting the training to work, is that we were the first host nation to win more medals at subsequent Olympic Games. So that is a total of 67 Olympic medals in Rio and 147 at the Paralympics, 67 Olympic, 147 know that in your countries the sporting success of your teams and athletes will have a very similar effect. Our motto is to inspire the nation. There is, of course, a political and public purpose behind that, which is to encourage people to take up sport. But I put this up there because I think it illustrates that we all know the important role that sport plays in national life. But as we all also know, the kinds of decisions that sports organisations now have to take are increasingly complex, increasingly commercial, increasingly multidisciplinary, and increasingly high profile. And therefore, it's right that those entrusted with the responsibility to take those decisions constitute and equip themselves in a manner that allows them to do so to the best possible ability. So the code itself, there it is, like the Flemish code, it's available online on our website, or search for Code for Sports Governance, and it will come up. We did it because the UK government, in its sports strategy, a big document that it published 2 years ago, asked ourselves in Sport England to write, quote-unquote, the gold standard for governing sports bodies. And the UK government was very clear that compliance with this governance code would be mandatory for all sports bodies seeking public funding. That's all sports bodies. So as a result, the code has to be and is pragmatic and flexible, because we deal with an enormous array of sporting organisations. But whether we're funding the biggest sports governing body in the land or a little village football club who wants to repaint its pavilion, there are 5 principles of the code, and they all apply to every investment. These principles won't be a surprise to you if you've read any governance frameworks, and like Arno, we read dozens before we wrote our code. You'll find that they all outline a very similar picture. So the first principle is about structure and requires organisations to have a clear and appropriate governance structure. The second principle, it's no good having the right structure unless you have the right people. So this requires sporting organisations to have people in their leadership and board positions of appropriate diversity, appropriate independence, and with the skills and experience necessary to take effective decisions. Thirdly, communication. Organisations must be transparent and must engage appropriately with their stakeholders. In some ways, stakeholder engagement, I think, is one of the most interesting and powerful provisions of the code. You won't be surprised to hear that we require our sporting organisations to act with integrity and also to be always in the process of continuous improvement. And finally, we tried to find a sexy name in policies and procedures, but sometimes we've just got to say over to what it does. This is really about legal obligations and making sure organisations understand their legal obligations and deliver them. So some of the key requirements of the code, we require the board to be the ultimate decision-making body in the organisation. All board members have term limits, as do if the sport has a council, often called a general assembly, or council members. The board must have at least 25% of its members independent non-executive directors, and there is a definition of independent within the code. Basically, it's anybody who doesn't have a close connection with the organisation, such as being an employee, holding a political position, holding a position with a key commercial partner. We do not mandate independent directors across the board. We recognise that those who come up through the sport via the political and democratic routes bring something really valuable to their boards. But nevertheless, we ask organisations to have an eye on the skills and experience that its board needs, even for those political positions from within the sport. All organisations have to adopt a commitment to gender parity on the board and to wider diversity, looking at some of the other key matrices of diversity, greater transparency and integrity I've mentioned. So, governance action plans, perhaps I'm very similar to your meta sheets on there. What we did is, after the code was published, we spent 6 months analysing the existing governance of about 60 sports national governing bodies against the code. And I have to say, in fairness to British sport, governance wasn't broken. It was good. and in fact, I think if it hadn't been good, we couldn't have written the gold standard. But we wanted to make it excellent. So everybody got a bespoke governance action plan mapping out what they needed to do in order to become compliant by the 31st of October. Alongside that, we had a package of support in place for them, both from a dedicated governance manager working within UK Sport, and where appropriate we could source for them and help them with external professional advice or indeed peer support when one sport has done so well, and we think that that could be shared more widely. So where are we now? I'm just going to skip ahead because we will realise that 31st of October has been and gone, and we're now assessing compliance. Across 60 organisations, that means that there are 3,000 individual governance requirements to assess. I'm glad to have left the office for a couple of days and to doing that. Thank you very much. We've had submitted to us over 1,000 individual pieces of evidence, and the assessment process is underway. It hasn't finished, so we can't yet say who's compliant and who isn't. If I can go back, I'll give you some headlines. Across all our organisations, these changes have been made. The board is now the ultimate decision-making body. Term limits are in place. Board size limits are in place. Maximum size of 12. 25% independent non-executive directors on every board, and an immediate target to progress to at least 30% of each gender, a measure which many of our sports already meet, and a public commitment to gender parity, all in place. And I do think, I spent the past couple of weeks sitting there with governance action plans, which are just spreadsheets, they look very like a community sheet, and I had a couple of moments where I just went, wow, it's staggering the scale of what's going on over the summer, and I do think that this summer, as the headline of that slide says, essentially British sport has rewritten how it is run itself. So, the code is not mandatory, but there are consequences of non-compliance. It is mandatory to be compliant with it in order to receive public funding, which, as I said, totals some €800 million every 4-year cycle. We will, however, give any organisation which is non-compliant a period of remedy. We're a public organisation. We have to act fairly and reasonably and do that. And our aim is to get everyone compliant. We're not sitting in the office trying to trip people up. We want to support and help people so that we can talk about the entire sector being compliant. I want to end on that slide. That is, it's not the UK Sport Governance Team going, hooray, we've assessed 1,000 pieces of evidence. Well, I'm hoping we will feel like that maybe by the end of next week. I put that up because I always like to end on what it's all about and bring it back to that, and that is, of course, Team GB hockey winning gold at Rio. Why does good governance matter? Is it just an academic exercise? No. We want to see more of this. I have come to believe over the years of UK sport career, 16, 17 years working in sport, that a badly run organisation can achieve success. I do believe that because I've seen it. But what I also believe is that a badly run organisation can't maintain success. And we're often asked, is this not government interference in the autonomy of sport? And again, something I've come to see over the 2 years that I've been working on the code is that this is not about removing the autonomy of sport. It's actually about making sporting organisations fit to exercise autonomy. So that's what we've done. We've been delighted to share our experience on a one-to-one basis. Just get in touch with me. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Jane, for this very interesting presentation and your excellent work. Hard work, some more days to go, so I wish you all luck with that. Thank you again. So this was the perspective from UK Sport. We stay in the UK, but now we go to a more academic perspective, although I'm not sure whether there's a big difference, but we'll find out. The floor is to Marc Taylor. He is senior lecturer at 2 universities, one in Sheffield Hallam, and he's also a lecturer at the School of Law and Politics in Cardiff, which is in Wales. Is that right? Mark?
Almost.
Almost in Wales?
No, almost in terms of the relevance. I'll start off with Is it Goedemiddag? I'm not sure. That's 10th, now we're in the Netherlands. I'm a senior lecturer in the Academy of Sport and Physical Activity at Sheffield Hallam University, but I'm a part-time PhD student at Cardiff University. And my PhD is looking at stakeholder saliency, looking at governance and strategy, and how strategic can your not-for-profit sport board be? So that's the question. I do sit, and I've sat as a full-time academic since 2011, but I alluded to a comment earlier on about tacit knowledge. I haven't always sat in academia. I used to have a different role beforehand. I've got a number of different slides that I'm going to flick through, but in terms of transparency that I will talk about, I'll put them on so they'll all be available for your on the Play the Game website later. So, background to some of my framing of thinking, some of the research objectives, some of the findings and some observations. It's not a static piece of work, it's a continuing piece of work for me. So in terms of my background, I said that I'm a full-time academic, but beforehand I used to be a management or sport business consultant in the sports business group at Deloitte, and a number of their competitors are involved in the original UK sport investing in change work. That happened in 2003, and I joined the group just after. I have been an independent board member of what is now termed Swim England, so for 4 years. And I have done some academic research which has been published in a leading academic journal for business and ethics globally, where I looked at structure and size of boards. So that's some background that I come with. And that work's been acknowledged by Play the Game, the European Commission, and I have presented elements of this as part of the Master's Programme for European Sports Governance at the IOC back in 2010. Some of my framing for my investigations, and James alluded to some bits that I can skip over a bit more quickly insofar as where I came from. I've seen a number of good or best practice governance recommendations from lots of different countries over essentially since the millennium. So looked extensively in the UK and extensively in Australia and New Zealand. I listened to the talk last night from Arnout about the Global Sports Observer, and that seems interesting because that translates it further. But now we've got this new governance code, and one aspect of that is to present value for money for the investment for the sport and maximise the effectiveness of those investments. However, if we go back 30 years in some of my interests in relation to boards and strategy, we've got somebody talking about the part of the role of the board is for driving the organisational purpose and leading the organisation strategically into the future. So through an exercise of good boardmanship. So that's a question that was out there. And yet, empirical studies of what the role of boards within not-for-profit sports and not-for-profit public organisations, what's the role of the boards, tends to be quite rare. I've started to notice in some of the academic literature in the last few years that a number of researchers are starting to explore the links between strategy and governance, performance and strategic performance in not-for-profit and for-profit organisations. So there's an emerging body of literature that's starting to arrive. I'll flick over the latest work because James just alluded to the fact. I did some work a couple of years back where I reviewed all the UK sport and home country strategic plans for what they were saying they wanted sports organisations to do, and looking at particularly strategy, strategic performance and boards. And my conclusion at the time was there wasn't anything that was explicit within those particular documents. You've gone on to allude, Jane, that that's now changed in terms of the entity. But it wasn't particularly explicit at the time, so I wanted a framework where I could explore this further. I equally lecture and I do some consultancy work around high-performing organisations. And one of the aspects that you've got in the leading organisations around the world, they talk about the best performing organisations having good mission, vision or purpose statements and linking that before strategy. So is that slightly different to some of the good governance direction that we've got? The IOC, if you go back 10 years, talked about having a mission, vision and strategy statement, and they have that transparent. So this gives me a framework where I could explore. I'm not looking at necessarily the quality of the words, I was just looking at a framework that I could explore. And I did, in a similar way that James just talked about for UK sport, I looked at elite sports that were funded in the last Rio cycle in relation to the public articulation of mission, vision and strategy and strategic priorities. And the conclusion that I came to when I presented this in Auckland last November was there are some gaps still within what was existing at the time, and we'll come on and talk about how I think that might have changed subtly in the last year. But equally, the IOC talked about transparency, and I've heard the term transparency a lot over the last day, which has been really good. But I wanted to conduct an exercise where I looked using a transparent method the performance of different organisations, using some of the terms and some of the words that we talked about earlier. So, in terms of case study design, I was thinking, right, I want to look at national governing bodies of sport in the UK and in England that they can look at, because the cases must be significant and of use to the general public and have some interest at either a theoretical, practical or policy level, either at a national or international basis. And I think that's the purpose for the conference, actually. There seems to be a lot of interest. So I looked at 32 national governing bodies of sport in terms of my case. 20 sports funded from UK sport, but I also looked at 16 sports funded by Sport England for the next 4 years. Now, mathematics in the room will say, actually those numbers don't add up, and it's because of some of the funding cycles that happen within the UK between home country and TGB nations. So I've looked at this in terms of the case boundary. And I'm just going to flip through for you. The reason why I looked at the Summer Olympic elite sports was they're the largest investment that the UK sport gives to elite sport in the UK. So in terms of principle of transparency, I thought actually that might be the best way to look at. And I've shown you here the websites of the organisations that I've looked at, so you can go and review those in more detail later. So that's the elite sport, funded sports. And then if I look at the participation sports, you'll see that flagged in yellow and orange, whether there's the same governing body for TGB stroke England participation, or whether there's some England national base. So I'd like you to just go away and look at those. In terms of my data collection and findings, I looked at what I wanted to look at was secondary analysis of documents in the public domain. So the transparency, equally, if anyone wanted to repeat the exercise, you could go out and look at that in terms of replicability of the study. So I used all public websites using a number of different approaches. Looking direct, breaking down the website in terms of the tree, and also using some of the search functionality around strategy, strategic plan, mission, vision, purpose, governance. If you actually look at some of the sites, they mean the same thing, they're just positioned in slightly different ways, hence why I went through that exercise. And at my findings, at an elite level, there does appear to be greater transparency in 2017 than when I looked at it in 2016. But I can't state if this is a cause and effect of the new governance code or whether it's a slightly different approach for funding within sport. I guess Jane will be saying, well, that's a positive, and I think we've referred to that anyway. So it's a definite positive observation, and there's a lot of opportunity to explore this in more depth further down the line. If I go back to my consultancy days of presenting this, rather than descriptive statistics, the next 4 slides just show you where they're mapped in terms of organisations. The national governing bodies, whether they've got mission, purpose statements, whether they've got strategic priorities listed. And that's not the purpose of where I'm at in the longer term for research, it's where I wanted to position where I'm at this point in time. And actually it's really quite positive that was alluded to in UK sports, in that there's a lot of positive direction for who's got mission and vision or purpose statements. And that's something to explore further. If I look at, and I know it's quite a whistle-stop tour, if I look at the wording within the IOC guidance, I haven't done a content analysis, I've not done qualitative analysis of the words to decide, actually these statements and counted that. That's not where I've started this position from. But interesting, if I was to look at holistically an oversight of some of the words, there's probably a lot more questions and a lot more research that can be done. But I have noticed that very few organisations so far talk about athletes, and yet that is quite a topical issue at the moment. That doesn't necessarily mean that there's positive or negative elements, but if the board of the organisation is not asking those questions, then actually that might raise other questions that some of the observers and the observatory work might pick up in. So that's where I am, and that's a whistle-stop tour, and it will be further research in the future for me to do.
Thank you very much, Mark, for sharing your interesting research findings with us. And again, if there are any questions for Mark, please save them up to the end of this meeting or this panel discussion. Going to our fourth presenter. So we're going to leave the UK, we're going international again. We're going to listen to Alvad Dudfield, he's head of sport for development and peace at the Commonwealth Secretariat, and he has a very difficult, or our computer difficult presentation. So let's see if this works. Right, Oliver,
Thank you, Frank. As I said, we want to move from the national to international level. I had two very simple questions to start, but after I came in just after lunch, I had a third question, but it's been answered. Will this work on the system? So the first question is ticked off. The next two may be slightly more challenging to reflect on. One, we look at global cooperation on sports governance. Are the diversity of contexts in which sport takes place internationally appropriately represented within these global coordination mechanisms? And then the second question, are the diversity of issues around the governance of sport given the appropriate attention within our global cooperation? Let's start with the first question, the diversity of contexts. Why is this an interest to the Commonwealth Secretariat? We're the intergovernmental body for the 52 member countries of the Commonwealth. Now, the 52 member countries of the Commonwealth represents great diversity. There's almost a third of the globe's population, and within that we have a member country, India, which has over 1 billion people, and a member country, Tuvalu, which has just over 10,000 people. There's a whole range of markers of this diversity. Another one, of the combined GDP, which is 10.4 trillion across the 52 member countries, there's 3 of the countries that are in the top 10 globally for total GDP. Another 5 are in the bottom 10. So when the responsibility is supporting cooperation amongst this diversity of member states, that question is an absolute critical one. So as a first reflection, I thought I would look at 4 platforms for international cooperation which the Commonwealth Secretariat has been involved with over the course of this year, and look at the organisations that have been involved, where they're based and where the individuals are based. And to meet the criteria of this personal reflection, I wouldn't defend your thesis on this data, but nevertheless, either international or for our purpose, a Commonwealth platform. First, the World Communication Conference, all play the game. Now, of course, it's based here in Europe, so you can expect some skew towards the number of organisations being based in Europe. We can go on to earlier this year, the IOC's second International Forum on Sports Integrity, issues on that broader question of governance. Of course, again, we've got well over 3/4 of international federations based in Europe, so you can suspect some level of in an international forum that type of data. The recently formed International Partnership Against Corruption in Sport, which involves Council of Europe, OECD, UN Office of Drugs and Crime, and the UK government as a key driver, the first informal working group meeting of that. You can see the data there and the continents where participants, organisations were from. Now again, held in Paris. So is the answer to take some of these global cooperation platforms to other parts of the world? Our most recent policy roundtable on sports governance issues was coordinated in Australia. So again, you can see clearly location makes a difference. But I think it is fair to say that in the global cooperation around the governance of sport and sports governance issues, there is certainly a particular geographical focus. Now that's not to say that this issue isn't high on the agenda. We engage with colleagues in the Africa Union who are looking at issues of sports governance. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations has also engaged in work on this. But the question is, when we look at global cooperation and learning across contexts, are we doing enough to ensure the diversity of issues that are within the international community are reflected in this cooperation? Why is this important? Well, let me go to a position that our ministers responsible for sports took. When they look at these broader issues around the governance of sport, it's clear that these issues are interconnected. When we take these governance issues to international level, they're no longer defined purely by national boundaries, whether we look at issues of doping, issues of match fixing, issues of the governance of international federations. They are global and interconnected. Equally, to strengthen the governance a range of jurisdictions, there needs to be a coherence between international cooperation, international frameworks, the reality of the national context, and national legal frameworks, national policy frameworks, and national organisation. And indeed, this is a good and interesting case study because, of course, the formal organisation, whether it be intergovernmental or sport cooperation, actually does bring together the diversity of contexts. So then the question becomes, how far up the agenda are the governance issues, and what are the governance issues addressed when we bring, whether they're from sport or government or a combination thereof, together. Here's the data from that very meeting that I spoke about. You can see it look quite different to some of the other specific platforms that we spoke about. So that can bring us to the second question around the diversity of issues in the governance of sport. There's been much said around the potential fourth presentation from my colleague here to the right, but we might have a quick sneaky third and a half presentation here because there's a very interesting start to the report around the Action for Good Governance in International Sport Organisations. And it does speak to, and I think quoted 9 different meanings conceptually in that essay to start that report around governance, and that there is considerable theoretical and conceptual confusion around this term. Now, if we look deeper from our perspective, we've tried to say, in terms of Commonwealth cooperation, let's look at the governance of sports organisations, be they international, national, subnational, and then the governance of sport in a jurisdiction, be it global, national, regional, and try to look at that through different lenses. And we can say there then that we start to get a sense or a framework to look through where, of course, how an organisation, a sports organisation, is governed. And you can see there a definitional reference in that regard from the last European Commission work plan, or once removed now. And then also if we start to take more of a macro view of governance of sports in a jurisdiction. And there we've lent on some work of colleagues of ours who work on good governance in a political context within a national jurisdiction. And critically, of course, being the term in that definition of institutions and processes that regulate the institutions within a jurisdiction. So if we go from those 9 down to 2 specific lenses to look at this issue of the governance of sport, that is sporting organisations, and then the macro governance of sport in a jurisdiction, and try to examine the cooperation through those slightly different entry points. Now, of course, we see significant cooperation, whether it be at a national level or global level, around defining what good governance of sporting organisations might look like. And indeed, if you break down some of the data, whether it be self-assessment led by ASLOF, or indeed play the game's independent evaluation, what it tells us is, of course, that there's a significant diversity around capacity of organisations, sporting organisations in terms of governance. And you can see the graphs here, which is the sum total of the different indicators across, on the left, the Association of Summer Olympic International Federations Governance Task Force, and on the right, the International Sports Governance Observer. But perhaps more interestingly, they start to look at some different pillars that would define the good governance of sport organisation internationally, and we see that increasingly moving to a national level. The question is, how coherent are we on defining what good governance might look like within a jurisdiction? Is that actually possible, given the diversity of context we're talking about in global cooperation? Now, what has happened within a Commonwealth context and Commonwealth cooperation, they've set a few very headline pillars. One, within a jurisdiction, shared responsibility between government and sporting federations, and a shared vision between those public and non-government sport bodies is critical. That there is a shared vision and shared responsibility. But a second point, and one that I want to really drill down to, is questions on what constitutes good governance must also include what's happening at a grassroots and a community level. And indeed, if you look at a number of our member governments who are also involved in recently the 6th International Meeting of Ministers responsible for sport and physical education, who have come up with, let's call it, a sport policy framework, it starts to give us some of those pillars around the governance of sport in a jurisdiction versus the governance of a sporting organisation. And there's 3 interesting points that they point to: inclusion, contribution to broader development objectives, and of course, the protecting the integrity of sport. Now, perhaps what's most interesting about this framework is that it is linked to non-sport global development goals. And through that process of looking at what might define the effective governance of sport within a jurisdiction, it is referenced against the Sustainable Development Goals, agreed by the global community in September 2015, to be a roadmap for the interconnected economic, social and environmental development globally through to 2030. Let's have a look at a quick example of how that works in practice. Gender equity and equality is of course a key issue of both governance of sport organisations, but also governance of sport within a jurisdiction. Now, if we look at the data, we do still see, and we of course know there's inequalities within sport participation, albeit that most of our data sits in the physical activity space, and of course the representation on sports governance, be it international or national. Now, globally, this governance issue is also a challenge across sectors. And you can see there 2 targets within the Global Development Policy Framework, the Sustainable Development Goals, which link very closely to the targets that have been developed in terms of governing sport in a jurisdiction. Gender equality, empowerment of girls and women, and in the full and equal participation in all aspects of public life, including sport. We can also look at issues around prevention of violence. We know there's a growing body of evidence of the prevalence of violence and abuse in sport. We see data where studies are done that experience of children in sport, here's a study from the UK of 6,000 children, may not always be positive. A lot of times it is positive, may not be positive. So again, we see a parallel here between goals in the global development policy landscape and what we might be able to define around the good governance of sport within a jurisdiction, which then becomes a road or an entry point for collaboration between government, sport and civil society, because the skills, capacity and policy frameworks to protect children across contexts, as one specific example, requires collaboration and shared responsibilities, not just by sport, but by those institutions that are responsible for protecting children and those who are responsible for developing the policy and regulatory frameworks. So, to conclude, if we ask our second question, how might we define the good governance of sport within a jurisdiction, I think it's imperative we look outside of sport. And indeed, broader policy frameworks, be that international or national level, provide us guidance and direction in this regard. And what I would say is absolutely critical. The question of the governance of individual sporting organisations is a different question to the governance of sport within a jurisdiction. And that second question is absolutely critical, that the community and the grassroots define what the good governance of sport in a jurisdiction might look like. And to close, I'll leave you with this quote that Eleanor Roosevelt was asked to define how do human rights matter locally. If we ask, how does the governance of sport in jurisdiction matter, I think we could use a similar lens. If we want to define that sport is well governed in a jurisdiction, then we need not only look at what's happening at the elite and the international level, but let's look close to home, where sport happens every day in every community when we decide our criteria of whether sport is well governed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Oliver, for your reminding us actually that the world is bigger than only Europe, and that we also should look outside sport and at the same time stay close to our homes and see where change is happening. Thank you very much for this. We go to our last presenter, which is George Patterson. He's from the European Commission, the sports unit over there. And nevertheless, we were saying that the world's bigger than Europe. We're going back to Europe now. And the question here is, what role can the European Union play when it comes to the governance in sport? The floor is to George.
Thank you. Thanks very much. So good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to just give you a very kind of general overview of what we're doing in the European Union. We've seen some, we've seen some nice concrete examples of codes being introduced in specific areas. We've seen a sort of global context, academic context. Now, I will look at it from the European Union point of view. I recognise some people here, but there's plenty of people here that I don't recognise, and I know this is an international conference, so some of you might not be so familiar with the workings of the European Union outside, and indeed there's plenty of people who live in the European Union and are not familiar with the workings of the European Union either. That's a different story. But just to put a little bit of the context and the framework of how we operate in sport, then how the EU works, then we can look at this little diagram here, and this is how it determines how the EU can act in certain areas. So where it says exclusive competencies, that's where the EU can act on its own, and that's things like customs union and trade, for example. The majority of competences, if you like, so areas and policies where the EU acts are shared with the member states, and that can be anything from agriculture to energy to environment to consumer protection, etc. So probably most of the policy areas are there. And then we have competence for supporting competence, and that is where you cannot legislate effectively, and that is where you find health and culture and education, and that's where we are also there in sport. So first of all, this idea that we can legislate, we can't legislate in the area of sports. We have to work, always working with our partners, always working with the member states, always working with the sport, because we have to say that, because we cannot act on our own anyway. And a lot of the problems that we're facing, these are problems that are very difficult to solve on your own. Yes, member states can introduce their own codes of conduct, but a lot of the problems like match fixing and corruption, these are global, and they go beyond the national borders, and they involve lots of different actors. So there is an element of cooperation which is absolutely essential, and that is certainly one area where we can at least help solve some of these problems and act as a catalyst. So very generally, when it comes to sports specifically, those are the main areas of activity that have in sport. There's a social dimension, there's an economic dimension, and there's an organisational sport, which is where we find questions like good governance. These three areas, they were defined in the white paper of sport, which came out 10 years ago now, and we go along to a session tomorrow morning. There's several over there who will be able to talk to you about the 10 years of sport since the white paper in 2007. It became in the treaty in 2009, so it's really since then that we've had this kind of mandate to act officially in the sport. And there are various ways of acting. One of them is a financial tool, which is always very handy, and this comes through the Erasmus Plus, which many are familiar with from education purposes, but also since 2014 we can also use it to finance sports projects. And then there's a work plan of sport, and that dictates how we work with the member states. And we've come from, there's been 3 work plans since sport was introduced as a policy in the treaties, and now we're working under this 3rd work plan, which determines areas that we're going to focus on for the next 3 years. And in this work plan, then we have various priorities, and those priorities correspond to the areas that we're looking at. Specifically, and as far as we're interested in, and as far as you're interested in for this discussion, is one of the focus areas which is going to be on integrity. Now that's a very general sort of definition of an expert group, but essentially it's going to be up to us to define, and working with the member states and the partners in sport, what areas we want to identify and to look at from the EU angle. And that can cover anything from good governance, anti-corruption, match fixing. There's some certain ideas. There's a lot of things going on in anti-corruption. You'll hear about this international partnership against corruption in sport later on. There's been a lot of developments with the G20, UNCRC, etc. So that's certainly some angle that we're going to be looking at. Good governance. We can also follow up from the work that we did earlier, looking at actually developing principles, but then it's not just a question of developing principles, but then trying to actually implement good governance and help it and get it embedded into the sports organisations. So, a little word on Erasmus Plus. Some of you here might have already benefited. Some of you may be interested in applying, so I see no harm in plugging the fact that we do have some money available to finance sports projects, which cover certainly not just governance. Integrity is about 20% of the package for Erasmus Plus, and then social inclusion, getting people active, all kinds of areas, anything connecting with sport is available, and the budget is certainly increasing since it started in 2014. So this year there's a current call open for people who are interested. That'll close in April next year. That's been open since last month. So if there is anyone out there interested or thinking about a sports project, very welcome. And we've already seen some beneficiaries in the Sports Governance Observer that is being talked about quite a lot during this conference. That's one of the beneficiaries. They've been awarded in 2017 a good governance through the Erasmus Plus financial assistance to help that project. So there's a number of good projects, and these projects are one way of actually implementing what it is we're really trying to do on the ground, and I'm pleased to see some of the successful results that we're having from that. And the European Commission itself, so it's focusing on more on our unit, then we decided 1 year ago to launch a pledge board or a pledge on good governance, to try to increase awareness, to try to get people involved, to make a commitment to support and support organisations to actually implement the good governance and providing the tools through Erasmus Plus to implement good governance. So using the standard basic principles of good governance, which are a combination of the IOC and good governance principles and the ones that were developed on the expert group. But essentially, we're all talking about the same thing. So how to actually take these basic principles, transparency, democracy, accountability, etc., and then implement it on the ground. So that is something that we will continue to be plugging and to be looking to as a tool to help also at the European level. I mean, there's other instruments on a global level, and you've got your national instruments as well. There's a certain space there which we can also try to fill. So that's essentially our next steps. We're going to carry on with our cooperation with the member states under the work plan, and that also involves sports stakeholders as well. Erasmus Plus, really making the most of it. There's a lot of potential there, so let's make the most of it. And from our particular point of view on good governance, developing this pledge and working with other partners, because working with partners is not just a buzzword, but it is really the only way that we can actually help solve these problems, tackle these problems together.
Thank you very much, George. Well, I lived in the European Union for quite a while, and it's always good to have some explanations about all the things that are going on there. Even for a citizen from the European Union, it's sometimes difficult to follow, but this has made it more clear for me at least. Well, now it's time to reward you, because you have been very patient and you kept your questions to yourself until now. But now the floor is yours, so if you have any question, please raise your hand. And if you want to address the question to a particular person behind the table here, please mention his or her name so they wake up and they follow the question.
Hello, I really enjoyed the presentations. Dave Ridpath from Ohio University. Wanted to ask mainly Jane, but I think everybody can comment on this. One thing in America that many of you may realize, especially back when the Amateur Sports Act was renewed back in the 80s, was athlete representation on boards. Now again, our sports governance model in America is broken. That's a story for another day. I like some of the things that you're doing in Europe, but one thing I do think that we're doing well, that when you talked about, Jane, mainly having people non-executives on the board, I do think it's important to include athletes and coaches. I just wanted to get your comments on that.
Can I speak into this? Yeah, thank you. So one of the things I've learned in life is always struggle with my code, and I can refer you to page 49. We don't mandate athletes on boards. We don't actually mandate any specific group to be on board. I was once asked by somebody from the Football Supporters Federation, because the code applies to the FA, Football Association, why we didn't mandate supporters. And I said, because not all the sports that this applies to have supporters in that sense who we can go to sports. So we quickly realised there wasn't a kind of pick list that we could say, you need one of each of these kinds of people on the board. But having said that, athlete voice is a massive issue. Within the UK, it's one of the very live and hot topics because of issues and difficulties that we've seen in the sector over the past year or two. Nobody's hiding from that. What the code actually says is that we deal with it under the heading of stakeholder engagement and expressly recognise that athletes are one of the most important stakeholders of the sports national governing body. Again, the headlines of the code asks organisations to kind of map who their stakeholders are and really think about what it gets from each of them and what it owes to each of them. Very, very simple questions, but which can lead to some quite profound thinking. And in the case of athletes, it asks that sports bodies think about how they listen to athlete voice. Now that could be by having an athlete representative on the board. that's up to the sport. It could be for those sports where there is a strong and efficient and well-run players union. That might do the job, but that doesn't apply in those sports. It could be through having athletes represented at other stages in the governance structure, a specific athlete committee. It could mean having an athlete representative attending board meetings and other key meetings as an observer. Whatever, we can help and guide, but we don't mandate it. But I completely agree with you. It's a hugely important question, and athletes are one of the most important voices.
Satisfied with the answer?
Yes, thank you very much. I didn't know if anybody else had comments on it for different countries.
Okay, our floor manager is already running. She's hiding, but this is Milena. She's doing a great job. Maybe just give her a
thank you to all of you again. A big thank you especially to Oliver for mentioning the business of community. I think if we take, in my case, I come from Scotland. I suspect George comes from Scotland. There's a big issue for me if you take Scotland as an example. If you take a huge organisation like football, our structure is run by the professional world of football. There's virtually no place for the volunteer guys in the community who are by far the biggest number of people. So it's so obvious to me the word diversity comes into this. We have to recognise all these different people. I'm not convinced big organizations can cope with the list of people that they're expected to deal with. At the moment, personally, I think our direction is to be almost exclusively about the community and not about the community.
Anyone on the panel wants to answer this question? Oliver?
Yeah. I think I agree, but I think it also brings in that question of the organisation of sport within a jurisdiction. What should be centralised, what should be decentralised, and then there's, say, policy questions around how does the distribution of resources or how do you organise a distribution of resources in sport, be they from public authorities or from sport itself, and what does go to national bodies versus it might be municipal or regional level bodies, and whether that's governmental or non-governmental. So I think it does come back to that question around an opportunity for more critical analysis of the organisation and governance of sport in a jurisdiction, as opposed to being stuck to rigid models that may have a definite contextual basis to their organisation.
Arnout, maybe you can add something here, since you've been comparing both international and national sports federations, or would you like to pause the question?
Well, I don't know if I can contribute to this question. Perhaps I can contribute to the previous question.
Sure.
And that is that in our project, in which Frank is also involved, and which involves 9 other research partners and universities, we have looked into athletes' representation in European sport federations, national sport federations. And we found that actually that issue was one of the major weaknesses we found. So only in 38% of the federations, athletes are formally involved in the policy process, and only 26% of the federations adopt their multi-annual policy plans in consultation with athletes. And we think that involving athletes in your multi-annual policy plan is a good way to resolve that issue. Because if you have an athletes commission, that can be very positive. It's not necessarily contributes to their involvement in policy processes. If you oblige federations to involve athletes while they are making their policies, then they are obliged to consult with athletes for whom they are making the policies. So I think that's the key, perhaps one of the key solutions to that problem. Involve them in your multi-annual policy plans, involve them in the decisions that involve them, and I think that will be a good start. But we have a long way to go in European national sport federations in that regard.
Thank you. Yes, questions?
Thank
you. I'm coming at this from a government perspective, and I'd like to ask the two speakers who are talking to developing a code of some sort. Number one is have you had any pushback from the national federations? And if so, how have you managed that? And the second question is, have you had any pushback from the international federations who jealously guard their autonomy and have a nice habit of suspending national federations at their whim?
Yeah, thank you. I'll take that one first. Have we had any pushback? What I absolutely credit our national governing bodies with doing is working hard with their membership to get them to accept these changes. At the end of the day, our sports national governing bodies are and remain democracies. The vote to require them to, the vote to change their constitution requires a 75% approval under law. And I'm waiting for one that happens at the weekend, but apart from that, the sort of 16 and 17 who had to do it through the summer all did it. And I know, because I've spoken to people who work for those sports, people who are on the boards of those sports, how hard they have worked to engage their members, which is what we ask sports to do. Again, it's stakeholder engagement. Don't take your members for granted. Win hearts and minds. I personally regarded it as a test of the code, because if we'd got this wrong, we would have got that pushback. And we would have got it from the membership and the grassroots, even if we hadn't got it from the boards. And some of the votes that we've seen, I don't take the credit for the code, I pass the credit to organisations who are working hard to win the argument, have been in the high 90s, against a bar of 75%. We've seen 95%, 97%, one was unanimous. And as I say, I think that's a credit to the organisations who've worked so hard to secure those votes. We did, like Arno, we did do some focus groups in developing the code. That was key. And I remember one gave us, I'll be honest, quite a hard time with our proposals. And that was a focus group of sports national governing bodies, chairs and CEOs, and we amended a lot of our proposals as a result, and I think we ended up with something better as a result. But I think the key there is, as you did, to develop this alongside sport. Don't do kind of top-down imposition on them. International federations, I haven't heard that from many of our sports, no. We've had a lot of interest about what we've done to see if it could present some learning. I take the point that what might work for our jurisdiction and culture might not work in the same way for others. Yeah, we've got any to add on that?
Yeah, it's similar, I think. Was there a pushback? I think thanks to the many corruption scandals in international sports governance, national sports federations realize that good governance is important. I mean, everybody is talking about good governance, so they kind of realized, okay, perhaps we also need to conform to, or start conforming to higher standards of good governance. That is not to say that we did not receive any pushback. I think overall federations were welcoming the initiative to implement the code for good governance. There was some pushback from a few federations, especially in the beginning, once they realized that we really wanted to do this together with them, and this is why it's so important to include them in your whole process. Then that started to change. We still had some pushback from especially board members that had been board members for a very long time. And I had severe discussions with a few of them, but I don't mind a good discussion, and I was very confident that actually I was right and that they needed it. And then in the end, I think most of them realized, okay, this will be positive for us, let's do it. In terms of the international federations, it was more difficult 2 years ago to establish contact with them to help us. It's difficult to get in touch with them. They were not that helpful. They are wary to open up towards an external auditor, and I can understand that. Perhaps I would be the same. But quite a few of them were very helpful, and I noticed 2 years ago that they were really looking for principles of good governance. Some of them realized we need to improve things, and they came more. So they were quite helpful and thankful for our review. But that was, of course, my
Thank you. There's a question in the back, all the way down.
Thank you. My name is Brian Cookston. Until recently I was president of the UCI, the International Cycling Union, and before that, for 17 years, I was president of British Cycling. So that's just about the whole of the lifetime of UK sport and its lottery funding. And I want to thank Jane and her colleagues for the support that they gave us over that period of time. However, first of all, in response to the issue of the international federation's pushback, I do think that some of these governance changes, and we at the UCI put a lot of time and effort into our governance changes, into our ethics code and so on, and revised all of that substantially, which is perhaps one of the reasons why I'm an ex-president of an international federation, current president, but we won't go into that. I think we've still got to think really, are these governance changes going to last? Are they going to be sustainable, or are they reflecting some new current orthodoxy in what is good governance? Some of the issues that have continued to worry me are about term limits. Now, yeah, we can all say that turnover is a good idea in governance, but that doesn't apply to members of parliament, for instance, and it doesn't apply to many other institutions. And whatever happened to the lifetime of commitment to a sport? I think, you know, there's an issue around that. There's an issue here about board, and I'm addressing this to Jane, sorry, but board has precedence over the Congress, the annual general meeting and so on. Again, that doesn't apply in the corporate world. The shareholders have precedence over the board. Parliament has precedence over the government, and so on. So I'm not entirely sure that that's the right model, especially if we are then having quite a substantial number of appointed non-exec members on that board. Well, where have they come from? What's their loyalty to the sport? Are they more concerned with their CVs than with the sport that they are now involved in the governance of, and so on? So I think those are issues. And Jane, I have to say that there's this very good reason why you've not had much pushback, and that was, I think you said compliance was not mandatory, but then the second bullet point was, but we're not going to give you any money if you don't comply. And we're not talking about a few £100s or euros, they were talking about tens of millions of pounds, euros, or whatever. So there's a pretty good reason why you didn't get some very substantial pushback, I have to say, Jane.
Thank you, Brian. I think, just to say, in my previous answer, when I gave credit to some national governing bodies for how hard they work with their membership, British Cycling, I know was one. So many thanks to you and your colleagues. I know that a tremendous job was done there. Where to start? I don't think this just reflects a new orthodoxy in governance. I think when we researched this, we did read a lot of governance codes and frameworks. I think you mentioned you read 30. 32. We got up to 10 and stopped because they all said the same thing. And having said that, I always skipped your last point, and there was no pushback because of the money. And I think it's incumbent upon UK Sport England to make sure that what we ask our sports to do is right. And we recognise our own power in the sporting landscape, because it is, the numbers I quoted in total, 800 to 900 million euros in public funding going into sport every 4 years. And I know, Brian, I'm not being naive, I know how powerful a lever that is. And therefore it is incumbent upon us to make sure that what we ask is reasonable. The specific points about independent non-executive directors, they're capped, they do not need to be a majority on the board. It's up to an organisation if they want to have a full board of independents. Some, but not many, of our funded organisations do, but the cap is 25%, and that is because we absolutely recognise the importance of those people who, to use your phrase, have given a lifetime of commitment to the sport, and who come up through the sport and can speak for the sport. And they have knowledge and experience of the sport that an independent doesn't. Fully accept that. I fully accept that. Independent non-executives bring something else to it. They bring other life experience, and they bring maybe professional skills developed elsewhere. And they do bring an independence of perspective, and also because they don't have that emotional, perhaps they don't have a similar emotional or commitment and involvement within the game, within the sport. They can speak in a different way and speak to different issues. Which is not to say that other directors don't do that. I fully accept that they do, but it's just having that independent perspective coming in. The point of this really is to create true diversity of opinion and thought and challenge around boardroom tables, which we think is important around any boardroom, be it a sport, be it a company, or be it the cabinet. By the way, the Sport and Recreation Alliance on Code Compliance Day, 31st of October, did a fantastic article applying the code to the House of Lords, not the House of Commons, the House of Lords, and guess what, it fails. So I take your point, our power is limited, Brian, I have to say, let me out, we'll put the world right. What else did you mention? Shareholders, this is a very important point. What the code doesn't do is remove from shareholders, and sports shareholders, as cyclists or sports members, their legal powers under company law. It does not do that. So they can still remove directors, they can pass resolutions on some constraints in the Companies Act about what they can do in terms of their resolutions, but it's still an important power. And again, we're very, very clear to reserve that power to them.
All right, thank you very much, Jane. I'm afraid, as you know, time flies when you're having fun. This is true now. And there's a lot more to discuss and to debate, and there's 2 more days of conference. I'm sure that the people here are available after the conference as well. But first of all, I would like to thank you all for attending this session. Thank you for your input. And of course, I would like to thank Marc, Stine, Arnout, Jane, Mark, Oliver, and George for their contribution. And maybe we can give them a last round of applause. And now you all deserve the coffee break.
Very different. World Cup in Germany. The federal government wants, I think there was a survey
Yeah. I mean, that's what I've read.
He can do what he wants, but if you have it
straks lezen natuurlijk. Het principe. Nu is het, ja. Ja, nu is dan zo die 15.000, die 15.000 dat er nu wel van de zomer dat er wel zo is.